It was just past sunrise in late October when Milo emerged from the edge of Flathead National Forest, his dark coat wet with dew, his ears twitching at the hum of distant propellers. A fog still clung to the tree line, casting the cabins and gravel access road in soft gray. Just a few hundred yards beyond stood the small regional hub of Glacier Park International Airport. Cargo trucks rolled across the tarmac. A flight to Denver had just lifted off. The world moved on, but Milo didn't. He stepped forward once then again and stopped. No startled run, no panic, no curiosity, just stillness. For a black bear, especially one as young as Milo, barely 3 years old, this was odd. They don't linger where humans dwell. They smell us long before we hear them. One scent of jet fuel or the leftover sausage wrappers from a work truck's glove box and they're usually gone. But Milo froze in the middle of the gravel road. He stood there completely silent, facing the cabins scattered just west of the airport's perimeter. He didn't growl, didn't sniff, didn't bolt. He stared, and that silence set something in motion. Inside one of those cabins, a retired schoolteacher named Clara Rose was folding quilts by the window. Her grandson, Joey, was still asleep in the loft upstairs. They'd spent the night talking about constellations, bears, and books, just the two of them. Clara had left the small propane heater running through the night. October in Montana wasn't forgiving, and Joey always kicked his blankets off. She looked out the window, as she often did, expecting to see birds or maybe a deer. What she saw was a bear, still as a statue, facing her direction, not moving, not blinking. She didn't panic. She knew enough to stay calm, but something about the way he stood there, ears alert, body coiled, eyes locked in, felt different. Less like a visit, more like a warning. She whispered to herself, "Why aren't you moving?" What she didn't know was that this bear had a history and a reason. Milo wasn't born near the airport, nor anywhere close to the cabins. He had been relocated here a year earlier, rescued as a malnourished cub after his mother was struck on Route 2, not far from the glacier entrance. A local wildlife rehab center took him in. At the time, his odds weren't great. Cubs who lose their mothers too early tend to either become too fearful of humans or too dependent. But Milo was different. He didn't panic. He watched, he waited, he learned. Officer Grace Holloway, the lead ranger who'd overseen his rehabilitation release, remembered the moment she opened the cage. The door clanked down, and Milo didn't bolt like the others. He sat, looked at her, then slowly backed into the brush. She'd never had a bear pause like that. It was like he was trying to memorize the moment just in case he ever needed to return. And somehow he had. Ethan Caldwell, a former firefighter and now airport groundskeeper, was the first to notice. He was doing his usual morning rounds, inspecting the outer fences along the gravel maintenance road. His cart rattled down the incline. That's when he saw Milo. Ethan stopped the engine. From that angle, he could clearly see the bear wasn't acting like a bear should. Not for this area. Not with this much noise. "He's not lost," Ethan muttered. "He's looking for something." He radioed the ranger dispatch. "Base, this is Caldwell. Got a bear on the south perimeter. Unusual behavior. Not aggressive, but focused." Ranger Holloway responded instantly. She recognized the coordinates, and a knot formed in her gut. "I'm heading in," she said. "Do not approach." She didn't need to check the tags. She already suspected who it was. Bears don't freeze unless something's wrong. Some call it instinct, others call it intuition. But in wildlife biology, it's often more practical smell, sound, and the ability to detect changes we can't. Black bears especially have scent receptors far more developed than bloodhounds. They can smell food 5 miles away. But it's not just snacks and garbage they track. They can pick up the chemical traces of decay gas leaks and even hormonal stress in other animals. So when Milo locked eyes with that cabin, he wasn't curious. He was trying to say something, and he had no other way to speak. Joey woke up on the loft bed to the sound of his grandma whispering downstairs. He tiptoed to the railing, still wrapped in his flannel pajamas. "Grandma, shh," she said, her hand gently motioning him back. "What's outside?" She didn't answer. so Joey peeked out from the side curtain. His voice went soft. "He's looking at us." Clara nodded. And then, as if the bear had heard the child's voice, he finally moved. Not toward them, but along the side of the cabin toward the propane tank just beyond the tree line. Then he froze again and let out a low huff. Grace arrived 10 minutes later. She parked by the service road, grabbed her field pack, and stepped out without slamming the door. She saw him immediately. "Milo," she whispered. It was him. No doubt. His frame had filled out since the release, but the eyes that same unreadable gaze. She approached slowly. No sudden movement. "Hey, buddy," she said softly. "You okay?" He didn't flinch, just glanced sideways at the cabin, then sniffed the air. And that's when she smelled it too, just faintly, under the moss and morning chill propane. It was leaking. She didn't know how badly, but in that moment she knew this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't some curious bear drawn to a breakfast scent. This was deliberate. The bear had stopped here on purpose. Grace turned on her radio. "Dispatch, this is Holloway. I need units at the West Cabin Cluster. Probable gas leak. Let's pause here." Most people don't associate bears with heroism. They're often seen as either cute or dangerous, nothing in between. But wildlife doesn't fit cleanly into our labels. The truth is, animals are often more aware of their environment than we are. While we rely on alarms, checklists, and devices, a bear like Milo reads the world through a different sense. He doesn't analyze. He feels. And sometimes that's what saves lives. Clara and Joey were ushered outside minutes later. Rangers swept through the cabins. Some residents were still in bathrobes. Others didn't understand what was going on. Ethan and Grace moved quickly, checking tanks, listening for leaks, closing valves. Joey kept glancing back toward the woods. "Where'd the bear go?" he asked. Grace looked toward the pines. "He's not far," she said. "He's watching." Clara put her hand on Joey's shoulder. "That bear knew something." Grace nodded. "Yeah, he did." Later that morning, the leak was confirmed. The tank's seal had cracked slightly due to overnight pressure buildup and improper installation, something that could have easily turned tragic if someone had lit a fire or turned on a faulty switch. The cabin next door, it turned out, had an old portable generator wired far too close to the tree line. That discovery would come soon. But Milo already knew. He had started walking again toward it. As Grace watched Milo disappear into the trees, something pulled at her. A memory. A moment from years ago. This wasn't the first time he'd hesitated to leave, and what came next would reveal just how far instinct and maybe something deeper could go in the life of a bear raised between two worlds. Milo's story didn't begin with stillness outside a cabin. It began with a scream on a rainy highway. 2 years earlier, in late spring, a call came into the ranger station. A driver had swerved to avoid a deer and instead struck a large black bear crossing near a bend off Route 2, just 15 miles from Flathead National Forest. When Grace Holloway arrived, the scene was still active, emergency lights flashing through the drizzle, skid marks trailing off the shoulder. The adult female had died instantly. But what the trooper hadn't noticed yet was the tiny movement just beyond the guardrail. A cub, so small his ears hadn't yet risen fully upright, curled under a bush, trembling silent. Grace didn't call for a trap. She knelt, waited. Let the cub come to her. He didn't, but he also didn't run. Instead, his eyes locked onto hers, and even as his small chest shook with fear, he didn't blink. That was Milo. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Bozeman had protocols. Orphaned black bear cubs under 6 months were kept with minimal human contact. No petting, no names, no eye contact unless necessary. The goal was always the same: survival and release. But from the start, Milo was unusual. Other cubs cried. Some tried to climb their pen walls. Others rolled into balls and shut the world out. Milo watched. He followed sounds. He sat for hours by the corner of his enclosure, nose twitching, reading the wind through the gaps in the fencing. He studied. every feeder's routine. The way tools clinked before mealtime, the change in boot steps when it rained. They kept notes, doesn't interact, over-focused, doesn't panic under noise, and most telling of all, too calm. Grace followed his progress from afar. She visited once every few weeks, part of her ranger assignment, but over time she found herself requesting Milo's file more than the others. He's not like the rest, she told the lead rehab specialist one afternoon. It's like he already knows how this ends. At 7 months, Milo passed his independence test. He learned to forage, navigate terrain, and recognize food scents from natural versus human sources. He ignored trash bait, avoided human-shaped mannequins, and at one point even bit a metal bucket that smelled too much like gas. They said he was textbook, Grace recalled later. But the truth is, he wasn't. He was reading a different book. The day of his release, they drove him in a containment trailer to the northern edge of Flathead. The site had been chosen carefully, for from towns, low human traffic, dense tree cover, and water access nearby. Grace walked beside the trailer, clipboard in hand, half dreading what came next. Most released cubs bolt the second the cage drops. Milo didn't. When the gate opened, he stepped forward, then stopped. One paw is still inside. He turned, not fast, not hesitant, just looked right at her. Grace didn't move. She didn't say anything either. She knew better than to speak. But something about the way he held that glance, it wasn't survival fear. It wasn't confusion. It was a memory. Then he disappeared into the brush, quiet as breath. Some say wild animals forget us as soon as we're gone. But sometimes, if only in rare cases, they remember more than we think. Milo didn't grow up like most black bears. He didn't learn fear through his mother's growl or the smack of a paw when he wandered too close to danger. He didn't wrestle siblings or climb trees out of joy. He learned stillness instead. Observation, listening. He was shaped by absence, and that absence taught him to read the world differently. Grace hadn't spoken about Milo in nearly a year. She'd checked tracking reports. Collar data said he'd roamed far, but always looped back to the same zone. Quiet movements, no complaints, no food theft, no sightings near homes, just a black bear living as he should. Until a week before the propane leak. That week, she'd found fresh scratch marks on a cedar post about 20 feet from one of the cabins. Not aggressive ones, more like a signature, deep enough to leave a message, shallow enough not to alarm. And there in the dirt below were tracks. Front paws first close together, rear prints wider. Black bear, male, young adult. She crouched, felt the grooves. "He's been back," she whispered. Not long after, local hikers reported seeing a bear near the Overlook Trail, just watching, not feeding, not moving. And the strangest detail, one hiker said they saw him just sitting, not resting, sitting, as if waiting. It's easy to romanticize wildlife, to assign them stories, traits, mandorals. But this isn't about fantasy. There are scientific records of bears remembering food sites for up to 10 years. Grizzlies are traveling miles back to places where they were fed. Polar bears are returning to seal dens that failed them the previous season. But what about bears like Milo? He wasn't coming back for food. He came back because he recognized a threat, something he'd learned in captivity. Because in captivity they used propane tanks in training zones. Milo had been taught to avoid them. One had leaked once during his early months. He had paced for hours, refusing to eat until it was fixed. They logged it as anxiety. Now it looked more like memory. There's a lesson here, though it may not be obvious. Animals don't need to speak our language to say something important. They don't need badges or uniforms to serve a community. And they certainly don't need permission to protect the world they live in. Sometimes we assume danger comes with noise. But in nature, warnings often come with silence. That's what made Milo different. Not his strength, not his size, but his restraint. While most wildlife would run, he stopped, while others would ignore the scent he remembered. And when no human noticed a danger near the cabins, a black bear paused still as stone and waited for someone to see what he saw. Joey later asked Grace, how did he know Grace thought about it? The training, the accident with the leaking tank, the moments Milo had frozen in rehab refusing to eat. The note she once wrote in his file responds to gas differently than others. She looked at Joey and said, he didn't know with his head. He knew with something deeper. That's the fresh perspective we often miss when we separate animals into categories: wild versus tame, useful versus dangerous, hero versus nuisance. But the world doesn't work in binary, especially not out here where cabins lean into forests and forests press back against runways, where bears like Milo walk the line between memory and instinct. And sometimes they walk back, not to reclaim, not to roam, but to protect. After the near disaster, Grace sat on the cabin steps with a hot mug of coffee, Joey drawing in a spiral notebook next to her. Clara was inside making a stew. The air still carried a faint trace of propane, now safely purged. Joey handed her the page. It was a bear with big dark eyes standing in front of a cabin. He's a cabin bear now, Joey said proudly. Grace smiled. No, she replied. He always was. But Milo wasn't finished. As Grace sipped her coffee, a second report came through the airport perimeter. Alarm had triggered again. Ethan had spotted Milo moving this time toward the old maintenance cabins by the tree line. And what waited there was something no one had expected. The alert came in at 7:36 am, bear sighting, south perimeter, still on airport grounds, no signs of retreat. Ethan Caldwell's voice was steady but tight. It had been years since he'd called in a wildlife alert. Most bears in the area knew to stay away. The scent of jet fuel, the buzz of ground vehicles, and the sheer hum of human movement usually kept even the boldest black bears far from Glacier Park International Airport. But not this one. Not Milo. And what caught Ethan wasn't the presence, it was the posture. He's not just wandering, Ethan radioed. He's watching something. The bear had paused again, this time behind an unused generator near the edge of the airport's emergency utility compound just beyond the row of storage trailers and the worn-down maintenance cabins no longer in use. Grace Holloway was still less than 2 miles out, racing down the service trail, her all-terrain tires kicking up gravel. She replied, "Copy that." "Visual on target affirmative," Ethan said. "Bear is stationary. Looks tense." Ethan stepped out of his cart slowly, kept his distance, clicked the binoculars up. Through the morning haze, Milo's silhouette stood out, muscles taut, ears pinned forward, nose low to the ground, tracking something just outside the compound. No rummaging, no foraging, no visible fear, just stillness. Grace arrived on site 6 minutes later. The sun was fully up now, casting long golden beams through the tree line. Her boots hit the gravel hard as she jogged toward Ethan, who was standing by a service cart visor down scanning the field. She didn't need to ask where. Milo was still there. Same posture, facing the cabins. Grace slowed, raised her hand. "Let's not spook him. He hasn't moved," Ethan murmured. "It's eerie. It's deliberate," Grace replied. They watched. Stillness. In a bear, especially a young male, is rare. Black bears are almost constantly in motion, sniffing, climbing, scanning. Even while resting, there's a rhythm to their posture. But this was something else. Grace reached for her field scope and adjusted the lens. That's when she saw it. A tank, partially buried beneath leaves and plastic siding behind one of the old maintenance cabins. Not a propane tank this time, something older, metal casing, dulled by weather. She stepped forward, heart ticking faster. "You recognize that tank?" she asked Ethan. He nodded. "Used to store diesel. Thought they cleared it out." Thought Grace echoed. She keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Holloway. I need confirmation on the Compound 6 fuel tank status. Request a full check for residuals and line closures. Potential leak." While they waited, Milo shifted. Just slightly, not toward the tank, but toward the building itself. Nose lifted, he was reading the air again. Ethan lowered his binoculars. I swear he knows something. Grace stayed silent. The way Milo moved, the way he didn't move, it wasn't confusion, it was tracking. Reading cues no human could. Subtle chemical signals carried through cool air, brushing his senses like smoke on a breeze. She remembered the training report, Milo's documented response to gas leaks, the pacing, the refusal to eat, the memory of scent. He wasn't just reacting, he was responding. Grace circled wide around the cabins to check for structural risks. That's when she saw the extension cable draped loosely along the side wall, barely visible in the weeds. It disappeared into the cabin's baseboard. She stepped closer, bent down. Old generator hums. It was running. Someone had reactivated one of the cabins, likely without clearance. Someone's been living here, she muttered. She opened her radio again. Dispatch, new development. One of the maintenance cabins appears occupied. Generator active. Request immediate shutdown. Possible fire hazard in proximity to fuel source. As she stood, she caught movement in the upper window. A face. Brief. A man's outline. And then it vanished. There's a kind of tension that builds when instinct overtakes routine. This wasn't just a bear sighting anymore. It was becoming something more, a convergence of past and present human error and animal response. And in that tension, Grace began to see the broader picture. It wasn't about a bear returning to familiar territory. It was about a bear recognizing a risk pattern and signaling danger long before the humans did. Back by the vehicles, Ethan kept eye on Milo. The bear hadn't moved from his new spot, but he was no longer looking at the tank. He was staring at the cabin, and that's when Ethan noticed the shift. Milo's ears flattened, his shoulders tensed. A low sound rumbled from his chest, not a growl, more like a warning tremor. "Something's wrong," Ethan said quietly. Grace rejoined him. "Someone's inside that cabin. And if that tank still has residue..." She didn't finish the sentence, because they both heard it. A sharp metallic ping, followed by a click from inside the cabin, not loud but unmistakable. Grace grabbed her radio. "Evacuate the perimeter. Now." Unknown occupant in unauthorized cabin. Fuel source within range. Fire risk is active. She turned to Ethan. "Get everyone back. I'll handle the entry." In that moment, Milo took a single step forward, then another. Grace turned her head, met his eyes, and for just a breath of time it felt like understanding passed between them. She didn't move. Neither did he. Two creatures, one trained, one wild, facing the same danger, and in some strange way working the same job. The rest moved fast. A team arrived. Airport security swept the area. The man inside the cabin, a drifter with a long record of trespassing, was pulled from the scene safely. He'd been squatting for 3 days. Bypassed power. Rewired an old generator. Cooked inside using exposed burners. The fuel tank hadn't been emptied as previously reported. There were still 2 gallons left in the lower chamber. Any spark would have ignited the entire siding wall. The cabins shared a foundation. A chain reaction would have followed. But none of that happened, because Milo froze, because someone noticed, because instinct whispered louder than protocol. There's a small lesson here, not just about safety or vigilance, but about how we define protection. We're conditioned to see animals as unpredictable, dangerous, separate, but sometimes what we call wildness is simply awareness tuned differently than ours. Bears like Milo operate on frequencies we've long forgotten. Their knowledge doesn't come from manuals. It comes from air pressure shifts, from wind changes, from scents most of us don't even register. And when they act outside the norm, when they pause instead of flee, when they return instead of avoid, it's not always a threat. Sometimes it's a message. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood on the porch of the ranger shed sipping black coffee. He watched as Milo slowly turned back toward the woods, disappearing into pine shadow without fanfare. No one clapped, no camera crews, no medals. But a line worker, one of the young guys helping clear the generator cables, looked up and asked, "Was that the same bear from the other day?" Grace nodded. "Yeah, Same one. The worker raised his brow. He's some kind of airport ranger now. Ethan smirked. Seems like it. Perspective shifts when nature reminds us what it's capable of. And that day, a juvenile black bear did more than roam. He responded, he warned, he protected. And just like that, without sound, without push, he reminded a group of tired, overworked humans what it means to pay attention. Not just to danger, but to life. But this wasn't the end. As the area cleared and the man was escorted away, Grace received a third call, this time from the West Trail outpost. A second propane leak, another occupied cabin, and Milo was already heading there. Grace barely had time to reset her radio before the next call came through. West Trail outpost reporting bear spotted again. Near cabin cluster, Unit 4 occupied. Possible utility concern. Request ranger response. The voice on the line was firm but unsure, as if even they couldn't believe what they were saying. Grace didn't pause. She jumped into her ATV and headed straight for the West Trail, a loop of rental cabins often used by seasonal workers and hikers passing through Flathead National Forest. She knew the area well, knew the residents, knew how close the cabin sat, how dry the trees had been this season. Ethan followed behind in the utility cart. Neither of them spoke. 10 minutes later, they arrived. And there he was again. Milo. Still, standing in front of cabin 4. Exactly like before, head slightly lowered, front paws planted, chest rising slow and deep. His nose lifted into the breeze, not searching but listening through scent. It was the same posture he'd taken at the airport. But this time, Grace saw something different in his stance. Urgency. Cabin 4 belonged to Clara Rose. She hadn't returned home after the first incident. She'd stayed with her friend down the road for a few nights, still shaken but grateful. Her grandson Joey, however, had left behind his sketchbook. Clara had asked the ranger station if someone could drop it off, but no one had gotten around to it yet. Now, Grace reached into her pack, pulled out the small notebook, and walked toward the cabin with slow, deliberate steps. Milo didn't move. He remained locked onto the side of the cabin, specifically the edge where the propane line met the wall. The faintest smell hit Grace as she stepped closer. Gas. Very light, barely there, but definitely present. She stopped. "Ethan," she called. "Can you confirm this cabin had its line serviced last spring?" Ethan flipped through a small maintenance ledger. "Yup, April, but it was patched, not replaced. Note says the homeowner reported a mild leak. Says it was sealed." Grace squinted toward the base of the unit. Her eyes followed the line down the wall. There was a new joint, fresh tape, but also a crack just below it, rust bloom forming around the edge. She stepped back, let the air carry the scent again. This wasn't a coincidence. It was happening again. Inside the cabin, the lights were off. No sign of movement, but the heater's pilot light, still active, sat just feet from that weakened pipe. Grace grabbed her radio. "This is Holloway, cabin 4. Confirmed gas odor, pilot active. Request full shutdown of cluster utilities and immediate evac of surrounding structures. Cabin possibly unoccupied, but potential ignition risk is high." Dispatch acknowledged. Teams were on the way, but it had started because of a bear, not a meter, not a sensor. A black bear who refused to walk away. There's something about watching an animal act against its own nature. A creature built for motion, choosing stillness. A species trained by evolution to avoid humans moving closer. That morning, Milo chose to stay, not because he needed food, not because he was lost, but because something told him to. And Grace, standing in the rising wind, chose to listen. She approached slowly. Milo didn't flinch. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel. She passed the threshold of his focus range. Still no movement. Then she whispered, "Good boy." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because it felt right. Maybe because something in him had already earned it. Milo finally shifted his head. Just slightly. A soft exhale passed from his nose. Not an alarm, not a challenge. acknowledgement. Then he turned and, just like before, padded back toward the tree line. No drama, no hurry, just the quiet certainty of a job done. By the time the fire crew arrived, the leak had been confirmed. The crack was slow, invisible to the eye without direct inspection. A technician later said the pressure could have triggered a flare if left unchecked, and if that flare had sparked against the pilot inside the cabin, would have been lost. Clara's drawings, Joey's sketches, the old quilt Clara kept by the fireplace for 3 generations. Gone. But none of it happened because Milo stood still. That evening, Clara came back to see the scene for herself. She'd heard the news again from neighbors. "Your bear's back," they said. She stood by the porch as Grace explained the leak. The line, the chance of ignition. Clara held the sketchbook in her hands, pressed it against her chest, and looked out toward the tree line. "He came back," she said almost to herself. Grace nodded. He did. Clara shook her head, not in disbelief, but in wonder. Most people leave when they're not welcome. But he came back. She looked up at Grace. "Do you think he knows what he's doing?" Grace answered without hesitation. "I think he remembers. And I think he feels something when he's near us. Not ownership, not curiosity, just responsibility. There's a lesson here tucked beneath the headlines and technician reports. Sometimes the best warnings don't come in sirens or blinking lights. They come in quiet forms, footsteps in the wrong place, eyes that won't turn away, a bear that doesn't run. And sometimes instinct is smarter than intelligence. In recent years, researchers have begun to explore how animals like black bears respond to chemical cues we still don't fully understand. Studies out of Colorado and Montana show bears reacting to minute changes in wind composition, even avoiding areas hours before humans detect gas leaks. One black bear in Idaho was documented returning 3 nights in a row to the same point under a porch, only for the homeowner to later discover a corroded gas valve hidden by overgrowth. Coincidence? Possibly. But if it's instinct, it's one we do well to pay more attention to. As the cabin cluster was cleared, Grace walked the perimeter alone. She traced the route Milo had taken, quiet paw prints still visible in the dirt. She paused by the propane line, studied the corrosion, and shook her head. No alarm system would have caught this in time, but somehow a wild animal did. Later that night, Grace typed up the incident report. She chose her words carefully. Under initiating party, she paused, fingers hovering. Technically, it was Ethan who radioed in the first alert. But he had only called because of the bear. She wrote, "Observation initiated by wildlife presence. Known black bear ID number at M421. Initial detection aligned with reported gas scent. Recommended follow-up. Expand protocol to include behavioral alerts from recurring wildlife." She paused, smiled, then added field note, "Bear behavior remains consistent with warning indicators." The next morning, Grace found a new drawing pinned to the station bulletin board. Joey had dropped it off. A bear sis standing in front of a cabin, nose raised, eyes calm. At the bottom, in big block letters, it said, "Thank you, Milo." But Milo's day wasn't done. As Grace began reviewing safety footage, another ping came in, this time from the far east side of the Ranger District. A backup generator, an old tank, and a cabin someone had rewired themselves. Milo was already on his way, and what he found next would reveal just how close disaster had come. The ping came in just after noon. A motion alert triggered by a wildlife camera placed weeks earlier by the Eastern Utility Trail. Grace Holloway had nearly finished filing her second report when the system flagged the familiar outline, a black bear moving quickly across a clearing low to the ground in the direction of a cabin Unit 9. It was Milo. Again. But this time he wasn't still. He was sprinting. Grace stood up without a word and grabbed her radio. "Unit 9 East Loop Bear approaching at pace. Visuals confirm M421, I'm en route." She didn't wait for a reply. By now the staff knew. Milo's appearance was no longer dismissed as a coincidence. It had become protocol. She sped through the winding service road past drying pine needles and loose gravel until the familiar silhouette of the East Loop appeared through the windshield. A single cabin sat tucked between two narrow hills, part of a retired fire lookout system, now used occasionally by volunteer rangers or hikers. No electricity, generator only, fuel delivery by request. And right now, the faint, rhythmic chug of a generator could be heard from behind the cabin wall. Milo had stopped just feet from the structure, nose fixed low, pacing slowly in an arc. Not circling, targeting. Ethan pulled up moments later, breath catching as he took in the scene. He stepped out, eyes scanning the terrain. "You ever seen him run like that before?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "No, never." She approached the cabin cautiously, keeping Milo in her peripheral view. He didn't acknowledge her this time. His focus was absolute. His snout hovered just above the ground, tracing a winding path from the back generator toward the base of the structure, then back again. Grace's boot clipped a metal cable half buried in dry grass. She followed it with her eyes. An extension cord, not rated for outdoor use. It had been run from the generator to the cabin's interior, slipped under a weather-warped baseboard. At the cable's midpoint was a scorch mark, blackened insulation, cracked plastic. Grace inhaled deeply. The air carried two smells, now diesel exhaust, faint and steady, and something sharper, warmer, burned plastic. She opened her radio. Holloway to dispatch. Immediate evacuation of the East Loop. Cabin 9. Improper wiring. Generator active. Fuel tank located within 6 feet. We have a possible ignition risk. A pause. Then, copy that. Units rerouted. ETA 8 minutes. Grace stepped back, watching the line of the cable. That's when she saw it. The fuel tank. It was partially hidden beneath a pile of chopped wood. No visible markings. No barrier between the tank and the generator. Not even a buffer zone. Just feet apart. One loose wire. One spark. 1 second. And Milo had known. He hadn't barked. He hadn't fled. He'd run. And he'd stayed. Back at the Ranger post, protocol was clear. When two risk indicators overlap, fuel exposure and active flame or electricity, all cabins in a 200-foot radius must be evacuated. That's standard. But none of it would have activated if not for the bear. There was no smell reaching human noses. No noise loud enough to catch concern. Just a silent animal pacing in the sun. The team arrived fast, 2 field officers, a fire specialist, and an off-duty responder who happened to be nearby. One of them, an EMT named Paul, took one look at the setup and muttered, "One good pop and this whole place lights up." They cut the generator, isolated the tank, unplugged the cord, and just like that, disaster faded into quiet wind and pine shadow, but the closeness of it settled into everyone's bones. Ethan leaned against the hood of the truck. That could have gone up while someone was sleeping, Grace nodded. Or boiling water. She crouched to examine the blackened cable. "It's always the small things," she said. "Something is unsettling about almost disasters. When everything stays intact, nothing explodes, no one gets hurt, it's easy to miss how close the danger really was." But Milo had felt it. Again. After the area was cleared, Grace walked to where the bear had stood. The dirt was lightly scuffed. Paw prints overlapped in tight spirals, like he'd been turning slowly in place. A behavior known in wildlife studies as target spirals, seen in black bears when they narrow in on prey, or in rarer cases on a scent they can't place, but instinctively don't trust. She'd read about it in a wildlife journal once. Never thought she'd see it. Certainly not near a cabin, not tied to electricity, not from a bear that had no reason to care. That evening, Joey came by with his grandma to bring baked bread to the ranger team. They'd heard there had been another incident, another near miss, another Milo sighting. Joey asked, "Did he stop something again?" Grace smiled gently. "He did." Joey tilted his head. "Does he know we're people? I think he knows we're part of the forest," Grace said. Joey nodded, like that made perfect sense. Then he asked something unexpected. "Has he ever been scared?" Grace paused. "He was scared once," she answered. when he was very small. But after that, I think he just started noticing things. Joey looked down at the drawing. He held a new one. This time, the bear stood between a generator and a flame, arms wide like a guard dog. He handed it to Grace. Maybe he's not scared anymore because he's busy helping. Grace looked at the paper. Her throat caught slightly. Yeah, she said. Maybe. There's a perspective we rarely explore when it comes to wild animals. We assume fear is their primary instinct. We assume distance is what keeps everyone safe. And most of the time, that's true. But every once in a while, something else emerges. Not domestication, not training, just awareness. Milo wasn't raised to protect cabins. He wasn't bred for it. He was shaped by loss, by the memory of noise, by the scent of propane in the wrong places. And whether it was fear or memory or some unknown thread between the two, something in him moved faster than any human protocol. He didn't know who was inside. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew something was off, and he acted. As night fell, Grace stood by the edge of the compound, coffee in hand, and watched the tree line. A few birds scattered. A squirrel darted across the grass. No sign of Milo, but that was expected. He never stayed long after the danger passed. No need to. He wasn't looking for thanks. And maybe that's what made his actions even more powerful. Some say bears are solitary creatures, but in these last few days, Milo had shown something different. Not attachment, not dependence, just presence at the right time, in the right place, doing what no one expected, and what no one else could. As word of Milo's actions spread, something began to shift not just in the ranger station, but across the community. Reporters started calling. A news crew showed up at the trailhead, and for the first time, Milo's name appeared on the front page. But the bear didn't wait for applause. By the time the story went live, he had vanished again back into the forest he came from. The first article went live before sunrise the next morning. Black bear saves Montana cabins from propane disaster. Then another. Unlikely. Hero bear alerts. Rangers to leak before it's too late, then the national ones. Bear's instincts stop. Explosion. Rangers call it a miracle. By midweek, Milo was everywhere. But Milo wasn't. The last time anyone saw him was a fleeting moment on the ranger station's northeast trail camera. Just a blurry image of dark fur moving through the brush, heading deeper into Flathead National Forest. No more pacing, no more freezing, just a bear walking away. Grace watched the clip 3 times. Then she shut the laptop and sat back. She wasn't surprised. It was how he moved through everything from the highway rescue to the cabin standoffs. Quietly, unclaimed, disappearing the moment the job was done. It wasn't a performance. It was instinct. Still, the story spread. A local TV crew interviewed Clara Rose on her porch. She stood with Joey beside her, holding up the drawing of Milo in front of the cabin. Joey didn't say much, just clutched his sketchbook and whispered, "He came back for us." Viewers sent letters to the ranger station, handwritten notes from seniors, emails from classrooms. Children drew Milo in superhero capes. One girl mailed in a beaded bracelet asking if someone could leave it on a tree for him. An animal sanctuary from Oregon called, asking if Milo had ever been in their network. A science podcast requested an interview with Grace. Someone offered to fund a live feed camera just in case Milo showed up again. But he didn't. The cabin residents, those whose lives were quietly changed, started sharing stories of their own. One man admitted he'd planned to run an electric smoker just outside his trailer that same night. If that propane line had sparked, I'd have been 5 feet from it. Another hiker said he'd ignored a generator repair warning for months. After hearing about Milo, he finally replaced it. It became a kind of ripple effect. Quiet, subtle. Not viral like a trending video, but real. People were listening, not just to the headlines, to nature, to silence, to the possibility that not all warnings come from humans. Ethan, the airport groundskeeper, didn't say much publicly, but on the morning after the last alert, he hammered a small wooden sign into the ground near the maintenance shed where Milo had first frozen. It read, M421, Watch Post, dedicated to the bear who stayed still, nothing flashy. Just a quiet marker. And rangers started calling it that too. Let's check the watch post, they'd say. Any new signs near Milo's post? There usually weren't. But once someone found a single paw print pressed into the dirt just beyond the edge of the trail. Just one. As if he had paused, looked back, then moved on. Grace never liked the word miracle. Not because she didn't believe in them, but because in her world they often meant something survived when it shouldn't have. To her, what Milo did wasn't a miracle. It was a memory. Training, scent, instinct that evolved beyond our definitions. What the public called heroism, she called alignment, a creature using what it had, at the moment it mattered most. And then refusing to make a scene about it. She did eventually give one interview. A local station asked her to sit for a segment about wildlife awareness. The reporter was polite, curious. Why do you think this bear behaved so differently? Grace paused before answering. I think sometimes we teach animals to fear us, and when they don't, we call it strange. But I think Milo just remembered. Not just what scared him, but what mattered. The reporter leaned in. Do you think he'll come back? Grace smiled, a little sad. He's not the one who needs to. Later that week, the ranger station received a thick envelope. Inside were 24 letters, handwritten by students in a 4th grade classroom in Missoula. Every letter started the same, Dear Milo, thank you for helping. Some were funny. One asked if he liked donuts. Another offered to build him a house. A few drew bears with firefighter hats and capes. One letter stood out, simple, a little messy. Dear Milo, sometimes I get scared at night too. But my grandma says if I stay calm, I'll know what to do. I think that's what you did. That's pretty cool. I hope you're not cold. Grace pinned that one above her desk. There's something profound about how quickly people connect with a wild animal once the fear fades. Most had never seen a black bear up close. But when they read the headlines, when they saw the still shots, Milo frozen near the propane line, pacing near the cabin, they saw something else. A pattern. A choice. A quiet intelligence wrapped in fur and instinct. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about reminding people that life, real breathing, untamed life, is always watching, always responding, sometimes helping, even if we don't always see it that way. Joey came by again that Friday. Grace was sitting on the ranger's porch with a thermos when he arrived. He held out a new drawing. It showed Milo standing at the edge of the forest facing the cabin with Grace's ranger truck behind him. Above the picture were the words, "He didn't leave. He just went home." Grace blinked a few times, then smiled. That's my favorite one yet. Joey sat beside her. Do you think he knows everyone's talking about him? Grace looked out toward the trees. No, and I think he likes it that way. There's a small lesson tucked in the middle of all this. Not about fire safety or emergency response, though those matter, but about paying attention to patterns that break, to animals that behave just a little differently, to silence that lasts longer than usual. We live in a world of alerts, of sensors and signals and AI-driven predictions, but sometimes the best warning is a creature who refuses to walk away. A bear who stands still, who runs toward danger, not from it, then disappears without asking for anything in return. Some animals get adopted, some get medals, some end up in textbooks. Milo didn't get any of that. But he left a mark, not just in paw prints, but in hearts, in habits, in how a small forest community now listens more carefully to the wind, to the woods, to the space between routine and intuition, to the possibility that sometimes the quietest voice can be the most urgent one. But while Milo's actions sparked gratitude, they also raised questions once few were ready to ask out loud. What happens to animals like him after the headlines fade? Where do bears like Milo go? And do we have a responsibility to protect the very creatures who protect us? A week passed, then 2. No sightings, no camera triggers, no tracks. The forest took Milo back the way it always does, with silence. But something lingered. Grace Holloway noticed it first in conversations that trailed off too soon. In this way, Clara Rose stood a little longer at her porch railing. How Joey asked if maybe someone should go look for him. Not because they thought he was in danger. Because they knew deep down he'd never been just a bear. And now that he was gone, something didn't feel finished. The station's inbox stayed busy for weeks. Donations, messages, requests from journalists, schools, and wildlife nonprofits. They wanted more of Milo. Wanted to know where he was, if he was safe, if he might be tracked, tagged, or monitored. But Milo had no collar, no number, no chip. He'd been marked once M421, just a penning code on a chart at the Bozeman Rehab Center years ago. But once released, he became what all wild animals are meant to be. Free, unmarked, and unguaranteed. That's the part no one likes to say aloud. Wildlife rescue stories often fade out at the moment of release. The gate swings open. The animal looks back, the music swells, and they vanish into the brush. It feels like a win. And sometimes it is. But release doesn't mean resolution. It means risk. Especially for animals like Milo, those that brush close to people even for the right reasons. Bears who don't run. Grace kept thinking of another bear 5 years ago. Different season, different story. He'd been relocated after getting into garbage bins at a summer lodge in Kalispell. Not aggressive, just persistent. He didn't bluff. Charge didn't break property, but he kept returning. Scent trails always led him back. Eventually, the calls got louder than the compassion. One morning, Grace found herself signing off on a report titled Lethal Intervention, Nuisance Protocol Finalization. She never forgot that wording. 3 weeks later, the bear was gone. The paperwork didn't say much about the moment, just that it happened, and that he didn't resist. That memory haunted her now. Because Milo had done everything right. He'd avoided humans, never damaged property, gave warnings, not fear. But what if one day he wandered too close? What if someone saw a black bear near a gas station dumpster and didn't know his story? What if a frightened camper mistook stillness for stalking? There was no guarantee the next person to see Milo would see what she saw. That's the cost no one puts in the headlines. Not every animal that saves us gets saved in return. Clara brought it up gently one afternoon. She'd come to drop off blueberry jam. "He's still out there," she said, eyes on the tree line. "But for how long?" Grace nodded. "Hard to say." Clara hesitated. Would it be so wrong to tag him now? Just to know he's safe. Grace didn't answer right away. There were laws, ethics, resource limits. Tracking meant visibility. Visibility meant risk. Once you chip something, it becomes someone's responsibility. And no one wants to be the person who fails that kind of trust. Joey had another idea. "Could we build him a place?" Grace looked at him. "A cabin," he explained. "For bears, like a safe spot, with signs so people know." Grace smiled. "That would take some doing." Joey shrugged. "He helped us. It wasn't a scientific proposal, but the heart of it made sense. What do we owe animals like Milo? Especially those that step outside instinct, those who act against fear, those who protect what isn't theirs. There's a name for bears like him among some older wildlife trackers. Bridge bears. Not a scientific term, more a nickname. It refers to those rare individuals who live at the edge of human space and forest space and manage to exist in both without destroying either. They're the ones who don't raid campsites but linger close, who remembers the sound of a screen door and still chooses not to run, who see firelight through a cabin window and stay just far enough away. They aren't common, and they don't last long. Because being between two worlds often means you don't fully belong to either. One letter to the station asked if Milo could be brought to a sanctuary. Grace read it twice before replying. She wrote, "He was born wild. He saved lives wild. He belongs to the forest." But even as she typed it, her hands paused over the keys. Because belonging doesn't mean safety. And even wild things deserve protection, especially the ones who protect us. That fall, a proposal was quietly drafted. Grace didn't announce it, didn't post it online. She just wrote it down. Milo Protocol. A new guideline for field officers and rangers if a bear displays repeated awareness, behavior, non-aggressive proximity-based stillness, signs of alerting rangers may document the event under signal incident. Not a nuisance, not a threat signal. The idea was simple start seeing. Before shooting, before trapping, before assuming, it wasn't a law, just a note. But sometimes that's how change starts, with a name, with a bear, with a question no one asked before. What if this animal is trying to tell us something? A year later, the forest hadn't seen Milo again, at least not clearly. A blurry print here, a snap of dark fur on a stormy trail cam, but no confirmations. Grace kept a folder for every possible sighting. Some were obvious misreads, just another black bear doing bear things, but others. There was one near the south ridge caught just after a thunderstorm. The image showed a young black bear standing still facing a cabin from a distance. Grace stared at it longer than she meant to, then slid it into the folder, just in case. Some animals roar, some run, some stand still, and some disappear the moment their work is done. They don't need applause, don't need framing, they just need not to be forgotten, not to be mistaken for what they're not. Milo wasn't a pet. He wasn't a mascot. He was a bridge. And bridges only work when both sides are willing to meet in the middle. And so the question remains, what do we do with the stories they leave behind? How do we honor animals who choose connection over fear? The answer maybe isn't in tracking them. Maybe it's in becoming a little more like them. Slower to assume, quicker to sense, and open to the idea that sometimes the forest sends someone not to survive, but to serve. In the end, Milo didn't return for applause. There were no final photos, no closure wrapped in a neat frame. Just a bear who came, stayed, watched, and walked away when he was no longer needed. But his presence didn't vanish. It stayed in the routine. Grace found herself moving more slowly near the east trail, pausing at the watch post. Listening to the wind longer than she used to, she noticed others doing the same. Ethan took to walking his route without music in his earbuds. Clara started leaving a small bowl of berries near the edge of the trees, never too close. Just close enough. And Joey, he kept drawing. Bears in boots, bears with maps, bears sleep in moss-lined dens. All of them carried the same eyes, alert kind, calm. At first, Grace thought these were just sweet habits, but over time, she realized they were more than that. They were signs of people remembering, not just a bear, but a feeling, a kind of reverence, like the forest had spoken once and people actually heard it. What made Milo different wasn't strength or size. Black bears, especially younger ones, are often overlooked, less dramatic than grizzlies, less iconic than polar bears. They're everywhere across North America, seen near towns by dumpsters in blurry trail cam photos. But that's part of the misunderstanding. Because familiarity doesn't mean insignificance. The black bear is a quiet neighbor of the wild. It survives by sensing change early. Snow shifting scent, thinning water. It moves not to dominate, but to adapt. And sometimes, as in Milo's case, to intervene. There's knowledge in that. Knowledge we often dismiss. A retired fire ranger once told Grace, "The forest keeps its own calendar. We just crash the party." She thought of that phrase often after Milo disappeared. Because the forest knew him, welcomed him, and when something was wrong, the bear responded not by fleeing, but by staying, not by roaring, but by freezing. That choice to resist every wild instinct and remain in danger wasn't random. It wasn't instinct alone, it was recognition, and maybe even care. Grace began compiling her notes, what she called quiet rescues. Reports where wildlife behavior signaled danger before any human did. A raccoon near a faulty transformer. A crow is leading hikers to a downed tree across a trail. A herd of elk shifted early before a storm hit. Milo's story wasn't the only one, but it was the clearest. Because Milo didn't just react, he returned. And that's what stuck with people. He came back, not for food, not for territory, but for the people near those cabins. For a child he once saw in a window. For a memory tied to scent and fear and fire. He came back because something inside him said, not yet, not here, not them. And perhaps that's the bigger lesson. We often wait for tragedy before we pay attention, for the explosion, the smoke, the siren. But what if we noticed the bear before it barked? What if we noticed the silence before the storm? Milo's story teaches more than forest safety. It's a reminder that protection doesn't always arrive in uniforms or alarms. Sometimes it walks on four legs quietly, without seeking credit. Sometimes it freezes when the rest of the world keeps moving. And in that pause lives our saved. One morning, near the end of autumn, Grace led a group of local students on a forest walk. They stopped by the watch post. She pointed to the sign, told them a story, not the media version, but the true one. She explained how a black bear once stood still when no one else knew to, how he warned them before any device could, and how he left not because he was done, but because he had done enough. A boy raised his hand. Is he still out there? Grace smiled. Maybe. Or maybe he's moved on to where he's needed next. Another girl whispered, Do you think he's watching us now? Grace didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, I think the forest knows its own, and I think it remembers who shows up for it. That's what this all comes back to, not heroism or headlines, but something much quieter. Presence. The willingness to stay when others retreat, to notice what doesn't look right, to move toward danger not for glory, but because it's the right thing to do, and to trust that even without applause, those actions matter. So, what do we do now? We honor him. By listening better. By slowing down when our instincts scream to whoosh. By choosing presence over panic. By treating the wild not as background, but as a neighbor. Because every black bear near your cabin, every whisper through the trees, every stillness that interrupts your day might be more than wildlife. It might be a signal, a reminder, a Milo. This story in the end is less about a bear and more about what happens when we finally learn to look beyond ourselves. When we recognize that nature isn't against us, but sometimes standing quietly beside us, watching, waiting, and ready to step in when we don't. Milo didn't ask for trust, but he earned it, not with a bark, with a pause, and that pause saved lives. Now I'd like to leave you with a simple question. Have you ever ignored a quiet signal, written it off, brushed it aside? What if, next time, you paused instead? What if you followed the stillness? What might you discover? Who might you protect? Maybe you've never been in a forest. Maybe you don't know much about black bears or wildlife or evacuation protocols. But you know what it feels like when something doesn't sit right. You know what it means to freeze, not from fear, but from knowing something is about to happen. And maybe now, because of Milo, you'll choose to stay a little longer in that moment, to sense, to see, to protect, if this story moved something in you. If it reminded you of an animal you once loved, or a quiet moment you didn't fully understand at the time. Take a second now to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next story. Because here we don't just tell stories about animals. We tell stories about the wisdom they leave behind, and how sometimes one quiet life in the wild can bring us all back to what really matters.